Next is my friend Robert Anthony Peters. He acts, produces, and directs in theatre and film. His most recognizable acting roles are in The Pursuit of Happyness and Steve Jobs. He lectures internationally on the relationship between art and liberty. He will be talking about Stoicism, a libertarian philosophy for living. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert Anthony Peters.
Well, it's a real treat to be here. I've been wanting to come to this event for some time now. I really think Jayant needs more praise than I would be able to give him for engaging on this topic. This area, it's something. So many conferences we focus on the nitty-gritty, right? We talk about the details, the policy flaws, how things can be more efficient. But what really captures the imagination, captures people and their hearts is the discussion of morality. On the flight out here, I was reading, are some of you familiar with the Atlas Network? Show of hands. They provide resources and support for a lot of groups around the world who are engaged in advocacy for markets. They came out with their summer edition, their quarterly journal called Freedom's Champions. And there was an article in it titled A Recipe to End Latin America's Love Affair with Socialism by Axel Kaiser, who is a director of an organization in South America. He's very familiar with what's going on the ground there. And he wrote this: the purely rationalistic, evidence-based approach, although necessary at some level of the debate, has already failed in substantially changing people's sentiments towards free markets. New think tanks should avoid the purely technical debate and engage in creating a moral case in favor of individual freedom. So Jayant is already leading the way here, and I also thought some of you are probably familiar with Butler Schaefer. He was a law professor at Southwestern. Great guy. He tells a wonderful story about Murray Rothbard, whom I'm sure many of you know. Was in a debate with Harold Demsetz, and finally he just says, Harold, these kids aren't going to go to the barricades over lowered transaction costs. And that's exactly, a lesson that we're still continuing to learn and relearn. And I just want to thank Jayant again. Maybe I'll steal Rick's move there. And please, let's give Jayant a round of applause for bringing morality back to the discussion here. So I'm here today to talk about Stoicism. I've long been interested in Stoic ideas. Probably like many of you in here, I was an odd child with odd interests. I know Jayant and I have talked about this. Many libertarians seem to have grown up not being as interested in what their peers were doing or what kind of the majority was interested in. But we were kind of delving into to topics that fascinated us. I know for me, I was always curious about religions, about myths, Nordic, Celtic, Roman, Greek, codes of conduct, chivalry, philosophy, Victorian norms. These things I thought were fascinating, how a society kind of develops and operates. And as I grew older, expanded into the political realm, right? That's what adults pay attention to, the important things, right? The tribes at war with each other. And, went from, I grew up in San Francisco, so to be a true rebellious youth, I was a conservative. Fortunately evolved into a libertarian and then got a little more sense and residing comfortably in the anarcho-capitalist position. But as I was going, like many of us do, we want these other identities that we bring on to fit in with our understanding of the world. And fortunately for me, I felt that Stoicism was still very agreeable, very amenable to these positions, particularly the libertarian or ANCAP position. Stoicism, as some of you probably have noticed, has kind of had a resurgence as of late. And it's very popular. There's Ryan Holiday with the Daily Stoic newsletter and all sorts of materials and coins and tchotchkes, which is very funny because I can't imagine Marcus Aurelius going online buying a physical medallion to keep in his pockets. But it's had some great events. Stoicon is an event that's available to attend yearly. This year it's in London in a couple of months. And a fun one, if you have a week in, I think it's May, I've gone 2 years now to the Stoic camp put on by the University of Wyoming. It's nowhere near as arduous as it may sound, but I come from Arizona, so Wyoming in May is still damn cold. But it's a great opportunity to discuss ideas in a Socratic setting, reading Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, and tons of fun. So it's wonderful because there's just so many ways in which now you can explore these ideas. How many of you are familiar with Stoicism? Show of hands. Okay, great. Any practicing Stoics here? Okay, either of you Stoic sages? No.
What does that define that for us?
Oh, that's like the impossible end state that I was just going to step down and let you take it if it was you.
I occasionally sleep under my desk.
That's pretty good.
Keeps myself in reality.
Yeah. Marcus talks about sleeping on boards, with just a skin on it.
I use it to automatic.
Well, you're just keeping up with the times. That's all. That's perfectly reasonable. So what is Stoicism, right? I mean, we all have kind of a general, at least a colloquial understanding of it. There's some accuracy to that, but it's a complete philosophy. The Stoics have their own logic, their own physics, and their own ethics. Now, the logic, I'm not as familiar with the logic. It seems to me, and from what I can understand, that is very similar to the majority of Hellenistic philosophical schools and their approach to logic at that time. The physics are a bit challenging, I think, particularly if you've got a libertarian outlook. It believes in a deterministic universe, but one in which free will does exist. And so it's how do you face fate? How do you deal with this? Do you go along? Do you live in harmony with nature? Or are you constantly bucking up against it? It's a bit of it's a complex concept. They believe in a cyclical universe, one in which these life cycles repeat themselves over and over again, and every time you kind of have an opportunity to dwell closer in harmony with nature and what God, as they define it, has in mind. Now, they have more of a deistic approach to God. And it's a providential sense. It doesn't have a personality like your typical Greek pantheon or even the Judeo-Christian God. Their view of nature is largely compatible with concepts of spontaneous order that libertarians might be more comfortable with. And also in the sense that it's not controllable by humans, and that attempts to control the world are not going to be met with success or happiness. But we'll spend our time here talking about the ethics, because I think that's the greatest value proposition that the Stoics have to offer, and it's what most people are interested in. What makes Stoicism different is that their claim is that virtue is the only good. Living virtuously is the only proper aim for humans. It's the only worthy pursuit. Virtue is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for happiness. Cannot be happy outside of that, as opposed to Epicureans who may feel there are some other approaches, in which you can satisfy desire and focus on more material aspects and have a good life. we have one of the key attributes of humans that they recognize and feel this is our divine aspect, is our rational agency. And this, as Winston might appreciate, this is what would prevent somebody from marrying Michael Jackson, is that capacity for reason. And this is why, as you can see by the outcome of that, why it's so important to develop that. It's also through our reason that we appreciate virtue. And this is how we are able to understand that virtue is our highest aim, is through this rational process. Another aspect is that they believe that humans are capable of ethical development, and this marked them apart. So they don't believe in a static condition for humans either, much like most aspects of most libertarian economics or economics programs that are amenable to libertarians. They believe that we live in a dynamic world. It's constantly changing. And likewise, the Stoics believe that you can develop this ethical sense through reason. So we're not just born in a station and then that's it. We can improve, become more virtuous, and lead a better life. There are 4 core virtues in the Stoic world: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. And when you read about kind of Stoic figures in history, like Cato, you see these qualities that they embody, and always these tremendous, inspiring stories. Reading a little bit of Epictetus, you'll read about these characters who tyranny was nothing to them, and it's not that they liked it. They would prefer to live as free men. They have preferences, but they knew that if they lived with those values, that they could lead a very happy and satisfied life. One gentleman was convicted of treason or something to that effect, and he asked, "Well, what's the sentence? Is it death or exile?" He said, "Well, it's exile for you." He said, "Okay, well, did they take my property or not?" No, they didn't take your property." "Okay, well then we'll go to my offshore property and have lunch there." Easy to solve. I mean, and this is when you're comfortable with those values, you adhere to those values, and then he just applied reason to, okay, well, it's lunchtime, so where am I going to have it? I guess not here anymore. And they could lead a very satisfied life through their virtue. Another area that's, I think, where they coalesce well with libertarianism is their cosmopolitanism. They don't believe in tribes. They, for the most part, view humanity as one big unit, that we are all part of nature and all part of the brotherhood of man. I think this is a little bit curious, as Marcus Aurelius was going and killing Germanic tribesmen. I haven't had anybody reconcile that to me sufficiently, but I can understand theoretically that they adhered to that. And it's interesting how this carries over into the Scottish Enlightenment. Francis Hutcheson, whom some of you may be familiar with, he did a tremendous translation of the Meditations. In fact, I think this is provided through Liberty Fund. I think some of you are probably familiar with that organization. Wonderful group. You can get this book online. You can download it as an ebook or a Kindle, online library of liberty. Francis Hutcheson was a teacher of David Hume and Adam Smith. And Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments contains all sorts of references to the Stoics that are really loving. He has some criticisms of them, which is fine, but he certainly has a strong appreciation for them and the virtues, and particularly the cosmopolitanism of them, their desire that we live in a world in which many people are very beneficent to each other, especially when there's institutions that lend itself to that behavior. Want to talk briefly about the three main figures, influential figures, is Marcus Aurelius, who was emperor of Rome. You guys are at least familiar with him from Gladiator, where he was the guy who wanted to make Russell Crowe the next leader of Rome. He wrote this book here, The Meditations, that I urge you to definitely check out. It's a lot of fun. And Seneca is known for his collection of letters in particular. He had kind of a humble upbringing, right? Like Marcus Aurelius, emperor. Like a lot of philosophies are going to work at that point. You got a pretty good life. Seneca starts out in a little bit humbler origins. His father was a knight. He was born in Hispania, what's now Spain. He became a businessman, did very well, became a playwright, celebrated as that, was an advisor to Nero. Things were good, except, with Nero it never lasts forever, but he didn't have the best end as well, but he controlled it. We can talk about Stoic suicide afterwards. And lastly, Epictetus. And this, to me, Epictetus, if you read anything of the Stoics after this, which I hope you do, Epictetus is the best guy. Born in Turkey, was a slave. It's not clear whether he was crippled from birth or became crippled by his master, or at what point he was crippled, but one master had brought him to Rome. He was working there, and then he earned his freedom and had been studying with, probably because he was just such a sharp guy. His master gave him his freedom, and he was studying with a Stoic teacher and became a Stoic teacher as well. And then he was teaching in Rome until the emperor exiled all the philosophers along with him. He went to Greece and taught there. And fortunately, Arrian, one of his pupils, compiled his lecture notes into a couple of collections. One's called the Discourses, and the other is called the Handbook, or the Manual, or the Enchiridion, which literally means the small thing in your hand. That I'll let you make whatever joke you will out of that. But now, when you have a philosophy that a crippled slave and an emperor are on board with, I think there's something to that. It's worth at least considering. And I do want to take a kind of my remaining minutes here to read a few excerpts from Epictetus. Epictetus in particular felt that the ethical aspect was the most important, and that this was something that should be practiced, that it's not just theory. These are things that should be lived. This is a philosophy should aid you in living a better life, not just be logically coherent. So this I've got this Oxford edition here, but I don't recommend it. I think the translation from 1758 by a woman, Elizabeth Carter, in 1758. She translated Epictetus, and it's tremendous. I think it's one of the best ones out there, and this is just from the Internet Archive. And I'm going to start off with the very first line of the book. Some things are in our control, and others not. What do you guys think those are? What are some of the things in our control? Anybody? Shout it out.
Our attitude, our mindset.
Attitude, mindset. Anything else?
Our actions.
Our actions, okay. Anything?
Attention.
I'm sorry?
Attention.
Attention? Yeah.
Our thoughts.
You guys are great Stoics already. This is awesome. The things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are our body, property, reputation, command, and in one word, whatever are not our own actions. Now this, some of it can be a bit of a mindset change for libertarians to think our body and our property are not in our control, but all it takes is leave your bike outside on the street here for a few minutes and see what happens to your property then. or sit cross-legged Indian style on your legs, and then try to work your body at that point. We can't stop a runny nose. We can't stop cancer cells from spreading. So, we're very limited. But we do have a domain in which we have control, and it is, as you guys mentioned, it's our opinion, it's our attitude, it's our mindset. Yeah.
How, as a Stoic, do you explain Rick Rule controlling the natural resource industry?
Clear.
Obviously, that's
No, I enjoy it. Clearly, the Stoics have their work cut out for them to explain these anomalies of the modern world. No, I mean these things that we'd like to have control over, and what you say is exactly the point, right? So many progressives think that people have control over the natural resource industry, or that or that government can come in and control these things, and how futile we all know that is in the macro sense. And so I guess what I'm trying to encourage you to do, and I think many of you already understand this and are on board, is to bring that down to the micro level and really consider, what do we have control over, and focus on that. Because it's a rather unhappy path trying to change all sorts of things that you can't do. I mean, in the macro sense, look at what happened in the Soviet Union. Look at what happened in China. Look at what's going on in Venezuela right now. And who's next? Is it Ecuador? There's no shortage, unfortunately, Canada. There's no shortage of places that aren't willing to learn this lesson. But so much of it can start with us individually learning and applying these lessons internally, and participating in that change. Another one of my favorite passages here. It's a little bit longer, so bear with me. When you are going about any action, remind yourself what nature the action is. If you are going to bathe, picture to yourself the things which usually happen in the bath. And he's talking about a bathhouse here. I haven't been to a modern bathhouse. I don't know. Maybe some of you can speak to experience here. Some people splash the water, some push, some use abusive language, and others steal. Thus, you will more safely go about this action if you say to yourself, I will now go bathe and keep my own mind in a state comfortable to nature. And in the same manner with regard to every other action. For thus, if any hindrance arises in bathing, you will have it ready to say, it was not only to bathe that I desired, but to keep my mind in a state conformable to nature. And I will not keep it if I am bothered at things that happen. Are there any times or places you think this would be useful for you? Every single time, yeah. And particularly, I do about, 90 flights a year. Every time I go, and I'm about to go through TSA, I have to repeat this passage to myself. Because I want to be angry too. I enjoy it, but that's not helping me. That's not helping anything at that point. I'm not keeping my rationality. I'm not keeping my well-being. I'm just angry, and it's a futile gesture. So, but this is something, I repeat frequently, particularly in that situation. Here's another one I like, partly because of the allegory, but also I think it's useful, and it'll probably play into something that Doug Casey will be talking about later. Remember that you are an actor in a drama. And some of this goes towards their kind of view of a determined universe, but those metaphysics aren't essential to the ethics here. Remember that you are an actor in a drama of such a kind as the author pleases to make it. If short, of a short one. If long, of a long one. If it is his pleasure you should act a poor man, a cripple, a governor, or a private person, see that you act it naturally. For this is your business. To act well the character assigned you. To choose it is another's. We're all born different. Jayant is a brilliant, handsome Indian man. Now, he could view this as, as some people would say, a poor put-upon guy. He doesn't have all the benefits of being some white guy from the U.S. Or he could say, this is how I'm born. Just as how whatever our unique situation is, this is how we're born, and I'm going to be the best version of me that I can. And that's it. The Stoics are certainly opposed to the identity politics of today, the politics of envy and the political correctness that so many rely on, especially the progressives and socialists. Self-command, mastery over all the aspects that we talked about earlier that you have control over. Those are all the ways in which you can be, the greatest you possible. Last one I'd like to bring up. This is the second to last before his injunction to the gods. He leaves us with this note. The first and most necessary topic in philosophy is that of the use of moral theorems, such as we ought not to lie. The second is that of demonstrations, such as what is the origin of our obligation not to lie. The third gives strength and articulation to the other two, such as what is the origin of this is a demonstration. For what is demonstration? What is consequence? What contradiction? What truth? What falsehood? The third topic, then, is necessary on account of the second, and the second on account of the first. But the most necessary, and that whereon we ought to rest, is the first. But we act just on the contrary, for we spend all our time on the third topic, and employ all our diligence about that and entirely neglect the first. Therefore, at the same time that we lie, we are immediately prepared to show how it is demonstrating that lying is not right. How often do we get caught up with the logic of things, with the argument about, well, this is how behavior should be. This is how society should be structured. And how often do we contradict that through our own actions? And this is why I think it's so important what Giant has been doing here. And I'm in love with the idea of this conference, that a return to the focus on morality. Because we can get caught up in all sorts of argumentations, beautiful, logical Olympics, but really what's important is the morality that is the bedrock behind it. And so I'm hoping you'll investigate some of the Stoics to see what their consideration of morality is, and to see if that will assist you in your paths through life. And I think we have time for maybe a question or two, if anybody has anything.
Yeah, what we'll do, Robert, is that we'll let people also have coffee in the meantime. Yeah. But if there are questions, we can continue with the questions here.
Sure.
Thank you.